This is a production of Cornell University.
So thank you all, and thank you especially to Henry and Ravi for organizing this, and to Sue Snyder, who's been so efficient at making things happen. I apologize for reading this. There was no way I was going to stay within my allotted time unless I confined myself to reading, so I'm going to do that. I've been very puzzled for a number of years about the nature of climate justice, and I think these days a lot about long-term climate effects. And so I'm trying to bring the two things together. This is very much a work in progress. And I'm going to make some suggestions, but certainly not a well-worked out view at this point. So I want to start with the thought that greenhouse gas emissions kill people. And they kill lots of people. Recent estimates of the global mortality rate attributable to anthropogenic climate change at present or in the next few decades, all yield figures in the hundreds of thousands. So we have these four studies, at least. Global Humanitarian Forum 2009, 3,000 people currently dying due to climate change. Development Assistance, Research Associates 2012 says 400,000 with 700,000 by 2030. The World Health Organization says 250,000 in the period 2030 to 2050. They actually estimate in the low 100,000s currently. This is only due to selected causes, though they're not looking at a wide range of causes. The recent paper in The Lancet by Springman et al. Says 500,000 by 2050, merely from reduction in food availability. And also, these are the only studies I know of. Maybe you know of others, but they're all in the low hundreds of thousands currently. None of these studies, none of these studies account for deaths resulting from attempted migration or military action attributable to climate change. There is some evidence, for example, that drought induced by climate change helped to spark the Syrian civil war and the resultant migrations into Europe and elsewhere. If such effects were considered, the mortality rates would be higher. Military establishments worldwide are preparing for climate change-induced conflict. A little while ago, I heard a Marine Corps Lieutenant General retired and a British Navy Admiral discuss this, and it was pretty sobering. John Broome has noted in his recent book, 2012, climate change will produce tens of millions of deaths by the end of the century. We're talking about casualties on the order of World War II. The number of, that's deaths. The number of casualties, if we count instances of dislocation, injury, and disease, as well as death, will be much greater, much higher by the end of the century. Climate casualties are not only occurring now, they will continue to occur long after we stop burning fossil fuels. In part, this is a function of the persistence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And here's some work, oh, there's the Broome thing. Here's some work by Archer et al., 2009, it's a little old now, who say that something like 25 to 35% of the CO2 that we now are emitting will remain in the atmosphere for 200 to 2,000 years. But that's not the whole story, because there are a number of feedbacks, nearly all of them positive, which ensure that temperatures will remain elevated for millennia after emissions cease. Here's their conclusion of that 2009 survey. Nowhere in these model results or in the published literature is there any reason to conclude that the effects of CO2 release will be substantially confined to just a few centuries. In contrast, generally accepted modern understanding of the global carbon cycle indicates that the climate effects of CO2 releases in the atmosphere will persist for tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of years into the future. The most recent thing I've seen on this is by Richard Zeeby in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2013. He's admittedly looking at a worst-case scenario, but the estimate there is 23,000 to 165,000 years of elevated temperatures. And you see the the temperature profile there in the diagram. So we're talking about some pretty serious duration of elevated temperatures. And casualties are a function of temperatures, among many other things. So they're associated with such things as floods, wildfires, drought, and consequent crop failure, severe storms, spreading of tropical diseases, sea level rise, and so on. And also with the violence sparked by dislocation and competition for resources. None of this is really estimable in any kind of precise way, but you get the picture. It's a lot of long-term death and suffering. In addition, we've got ocean acidification, which according to the Inter-Academy Panel on International Issues, which is the consortium of all the world's academies of sciences, was irreversible in time scales of tens of thousands of years. Again, there's a major food source which is severely impacted by our current activities. These harms are unlike any contemplated by traditional ethical theories. They accumulate over millennia, but their ultimate magnitude depends on humanity's total carbon emissions during the historically brief fossil fuel era. Any given act of emission contributes causally to the subsequent temperature elevation and hence to the resulting casualties. How many casualties will anthropogenic climate change produce in total? The question can only be meaningfully asked relative to a specified time period. Extrapolating to the end of this century, current estimates suggest tens of millions of deaths and many more casualties. Beyond that, prediction becomes quite uncertain. But it's not out of the question. In fact, I think it's reasonable to think that over, say, the next millennium, we're talking about casualties in the billions. Adaptation, mitigation, and geoengineering could, of course, greatly reduce the total. Everything is fluid here. Still, the occurrence of casualties into the tens of millions is already, I would say, practically certain, unavoidable. Strangely, some theorists seem to think that even if very large numbers of casualties occur, they will not amount to harm. The basis for this odd conclusion is the non-identity problem. I'm going to leave out a section of the paper on the non-identity problem because it's probably not of interest to a number of people here. And because I think it's a paper tiger, because I think it really doesn't show anything at all. The non-identity problem purports to show that it's impossible to harm distant future people. I think we can harm them in exactly the same way as we can harm present people by injuring, sickening, displacing, and killing them. And if anybody wants to talk about the non-identity problem, I'm happy to talk about that at length, but I'm not going to engage with that objection with this audience. I want now to just take for granted the fact that there are these great harms, that we're already committed to them, that we're already doing them, and then ask, what does justice look like in that long-term perspective? So that's the question I want to consider here. So there are two main conceptions of intergenerational justice that we find in the literature. There are others, but these are the two most prominent. Fair distributions of burdens and benefits among generations, that's one way of looking at it. Respect for the rights of future persons is another way of looking at intergenerational justice. So I'm going to take each of these in turn and say a bit about each one. Many theorists view intergenerational justice primarily as fair distribution of burdens or risks and benefits among generations. Fair distribution is certainly an aspect of justice, but in long-term climate justice, its role is secondary at best. What is of greatest moral significance is the vast magnitude and duration of the harm. The classic source of just intergenerational distribution, that notion, is John Rawls' just savings principle, the idea that each generation should pass on to its successors the means of preserving primary goods, which, according to Rawls, are rights and liberties, opportunities and powers, income and wealth. What is saved, however, according to Rawls, is wealth or capital. Hence, as a practical matter, Rawls and many others understand just distribution economically. It's my contention that in the face of massive casualties over vast time spans, just economic distribution clearly does not capture the idea of intergenerational justice. That doesn't do it. Much of the sustainability literature likewise understands climate justice as fair distribution in a fundamentally economic sense, and you can play around with what capital is, whether you're going to include things like natural capital and so on. But basically, it's still about economics, and it doesn't get down to the question of you're killing people. And so, in my opinion, is similarly inadequate as a conception of intergenerational justice. A different, more recent and shorter term conception of intergenerational climate justice, which Simon mentioned in his talk, is just distribution of the carbon budget. I've got a lot of skepticism about the whole idea of a carbon budget because, as a matter of fact, I think we're committed by our infrastructure to using it all up anyway, whether we think of it as 1 trillion tons or less. And I think the 1.5 degree C target is something we're going to blow right by, and maybe the 2 degree C target as well, just because of political realities. And you only need to look at politics in the US today to see the worry there. But I want to say that even if this were true, the notion of thinking in terms of a climate budget seriously distorts our thinking. And to illustrate this, here's a remark from my friend Daryl Mollendorf, who I agree with on lots of things, but here I really strongly disagree with him. He says this: our failure to mitigate climate change would constitute using more than our share of morally constrained intergenerational CO2 emissions budget, of a morally constrained intergenerational CO2 emissions budget. That would harm people in several ways. Now notice what he calls harms here. First, it would involve taking more of the CO2 emissions budget than rightly belongs to us. Second, it would undermine the capacity for moral choice of future persons, roughly the next generation, who would be left with the choice of either emitting CO2 in excess of the cumulative budget, and in doing so heaping massive risk and uncertainty upon subsequent generations, or making a rapid and human development slowing transition to renewable energy. And third, regardless of which choice the next generation makes, we would be implicated in the subsequent suffering because we framed the choice of that generation. Now, let me do this in a little bit more compressed way. Here's what Mollendorf sees as the 3 harms of not meeting the climate budget: taking more of the CO2 emissions budget than rightly belongs to us. Well, that's pretty abstract for a harm. Undermining the capacity for moral choice of future persons who would either have to break the carbon budget or heap massive risk and uncertainty upon subsequent generations. Notice he talks about risk and uncertainty. He doesn't talk about death, injury, disease, and so on. And the suffering subsequent to their choice. Notice, no mention of suffering directly consequent to our choice. Nowhere in this compendium of harms is there any acknowledgement that even if the carbon budget is met, millions of people will have been killed. This is the sort of thing that I mean by serious distortion of our thinking. It might be objected that there's a conception of maldistribution that is sufficient to account for the injustice, since surely large numbers of future casualties among innocent people constitutes maldistribution of risk. But the practical certainty of dislocation, disease, injury, and death over centuries, perhaps millennia, to millions, at least millions, perhaps billions of people as a direct result of a few generations of carbon emissions is not just risk. There is risk to individuals, certainly, but globally we must reckon not with acceptable risks, but with acceptable casualties. Shall we then count casualties and deaths among the items to be distributed? That might inject a dose of realism into our deliberations. And I really have no objection to that. I'd like to see the economists start thinking in these terms. Provided that these items are not trivialized by discounting, because they're not trivial morally. But that's not how intergenerational distributive justice is looked at today. Okay, so our second notion of climate justice is climate justice as respect for the rights of future people. The second approach sees it primarily as a matter of human rights. The rights paradigm has definite advantages over distributional approaches. Human rights explicitly forbid forced homelessness, harm, and killing. They allegedly trump practical worries that climate justice may be too demanding. They are, moreover, typically conceived as universal. It's widely held that all people, future as well as present, have them equally. Furthermore, because we can harm even distant future individuals, a simple right to non-harm suffices to justify, for those who accept a rights framework, a duty to refrain from unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. Some worry that future people do not have rights because they don't yet exist. The usual reply is that they will have rights when they exist, and that's sufficient to impose obligations upon us now. Now I'm going to, there's a quote from Steve van der Heyden, Atmospheric Justice, who makes this point. I guess I want to skip over some of this because I think that reply is adequate to meet the objection. The fact that future people don't exist now is, again, one of these kind of philosophical red herrings that people like to argue a lot about. But it doesn't really make much difference to the picture as a whole. And there's another section of the paper, which is only a small section of a much larger bit of thinking that I'm hoping to publish elsewhere. That much of our thinking is mired in a Newtonian conception of time, and if we just understood time as a four-dimensional space-time continuum, it wouldn't look like that at all, and we'd have a much clearer and better conception of the existence of future people. But I can't go into that here. So let's go over that, and I'm just going to say I think the rights approach is fine insofar as it goes. I have no objection to it in principle. The problems with the rights approach are practical. The main obstacle to conceiving climate justice as respect for rights of future people is not their alleged non-existence, but the proliferation of unfulfillable duties that the rights apparently entail. And this is, of course, what Simon was dealing with in his talk. I am a bit more pessimistic than he is about the possibility of, probably a lot more pessimistic, I guess, about the possibility of being able to fulfill all of our rights-based obligations. The most prominent source of the conflict, as Simon mentioned, is the conflict between the poor of the present and the poor of the future. About 82% of the world's energy is currently produced by fossil fuels. It's crucial to the development that's lifting people out of poverty, malnutrition, disease, and early death around the world. If to prevent future harm, we reduce fossil fuel consumption deeply and quickly, we cause more harm now. If we do not cut fossil fuel consumption deeply and quickly, then we may harm even more people in the future. This is the fundamental dilemma of long-term climate change. Either way, it seems, the transgression of rights is monumental. It may be necessary, as Amartya Sen, Mollendorf, and others have suggested, to appeal to a kind of consequentialism of rights, whose aim is maximal respect for rights. But that just means that rights alone are not sufficient to tell us what intergenerational justice is in practice. But perhaps the most intractable problem with conceiving intergenerational justice as respect for rights of future people lies in the realm of moral psychology. Oops, I'm going backwards here. Let me go forwards. So, how can the rights of future people motivate us? That's the moral psychological question. So we say future people have rights. We ought to respect them. Okay, now how's that going to move people? Those rights are supposed to give future people binding claims against us, claims that impose on us correlative duties. But this, in my view, is psychologically backwards. It makes us the passive recipients, there we go, passive recipients of duties that originate with future claims. But it's difficult to take these novel duties seriously. The legalistic us against them language suggests that we could legitimately be forced to comply. But since future people have not the slightest power over us, and there are no contemporary enforcers, no legal enforcers of their rights, that suggestion is empty at best. Compounding the psychological difficulty is a vicious asymmetry. Though the rights of future people allegedly impose costly duties upon us, we have no equivalent rights that impose duties upon them. If we respect their rights, they may remember us with gratitude. Whoopee, we get remembered with gratitude. But nothing that they do matters vitally to us. They might have something to do with our projects and something, but really, that's not going to cut it. That's not going to motivate us. So it's hard to see how we should acquiesce to the duties that their rights imply. Normally with rights, there's sort of this quid pro quo. We agree. There's some kind of reciprocity. This doesn't exist here. This is, of course, a pure intergenerational problem that Steve Gardner talks about. Rights rhetoric motivates best when voiced by the oppressed or their contemporary champions, who can readily arouse the sympathy of those who are not violating rights. Okay, I'll try to finish up. I may go just a little over, but not much. But future people have no voice that we can hear, and their contemporary advocates burn fossil fuels and so embarrassingly contribute to the violations of the rights. So that makes it a little harder, too. So it's unsurprising that the rights of future people don't effectively motivate us. Is there anything that can? That's my question. I'm not claiming that I have an answer to this, but I'm going to take a stab at it. There is an idea of justice far older and more deeply resonant with the human spirit than these contemporary notions. And there's a quote from the prophet Amos: "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-flowing stream." Justice for Amos is neither fair distribution of burdens and benefits, nor recognition and protection of the claims of rights-holding persons. It is the judgment of a mighty God against idolatry, arrogance, and the heedlessness of the rich, and the oppression of the helpless by the powerful. Some of y'all are looking a little worried. First of all, I'm not going to give you a theological theory of climate justice, theological conception of climate justice. We can think of Amos's God merely as the human psyche, the depths of the human psyche written into the sky, if you want to think of it that way, okay? But the power of Amos's rhetoric reveals something crucial about moral psychology that contemporary thinkers tend to overlook. God, or what Amos takes to be God, hates injustice. The hatred is born out of sympathy with the poor and oppressed and flares into anger at the abuse of power by the comfortable, the arrogant, and the rich. Such sympathy and hatred are, moreover, human universals. John Stuart Mill offers an enlightening account of the moral psychology of justice in Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism. Nominally, the topic is justice itself, but the bulk of the chapter is devoted to moral psychology, or more specifically to what he calls the sentiment of justice. I'm going to skip over some of this. Oops, before I go backwards again. This is the main thing I want you to see. The animal desire to repel or retaliate or hurt or damage to oneself or to those with whom one sympathizes, widened so as to include all persons by the human capacity of enlarged sympathy and the human conception of intelligent self-interest. That's what he takes the sentiment of justice to be. From the latter elements, the feeling derives its morality. From the former, its peculiar impressiveness and energy of self-assertion. Now, I've got a bunch of other quotes from Mill here. I'm going to skip these. The point is that this sentiment of justice that Mill talks about is a motivating force. It does move people. And Mill talks about the expandability of it from people that you know to your nation, to humanity at large, and he doesn't exclude future generations. Of course, he wasn't thinking about them. So we might think that Mill has an idea that might be of use there in the moral psychology of justice. You might think that we're out of the realm of justice altogether. When I've talked like this to other people, some people say, well, you're not talking about justice at all. This is not what we call justice. Well, it's what was called justice a long time ago, and it's certainly one reasonable use of the term justice. And let me be a little bit more specific about it, and then I'll quit. Here are 6 aspects of it that I think there's a commonality between this and Amos's conception of justice, this ancient conception of justice, and a universal conception of justice. And these are the 6 aspects. First, it is harm inflicted by a minority upon a majority. Many of the future generations that suffer effects of climate change are likely to be more populous than the present generation, and it is probable that there will be many such generations. Secondly, those harmed after the fossil fuel era ends will be entirely innocent of the harms, having made no contribution to climate change at all. Third, though those most responsible for the emissions are rich, nearly all of the victims of climate change now and in the future are or will be poor. I think currently the figures like 95% of people who are victims of climate change are impoverished. Fourth, the future victims of climate change are voiceless, powerless, and without recourse against the perpetrators, which of course is us. Fifth, though we sometimes burn fossil fuels from genuine need, often we burn them for the sake of unnecessary wealth, comfort, or entertainment. And sixth, there has been and continues to be systematic denial of the harm, not only by climate science deniers, but to a lesser extent by humane advocates of intergenerational justice, who use the sanitized language of risk or capital to describe the ugly realities to which I have referred. All of this has the odor of injustice. Okay, so I'm going to cut to the bottom line because I'm out of time. The most important manifestation of long-term climate justice, I think, is individual or collective action taken to eliminate carbon emissions that are not necessary to meet today's vital human needs. There are an awful lot of those. Such action can be motivated by our natural revulsion at the spectacle of the rich, heedless, and arrogant, unjustifiably harming future people who are, with respect to them, powerless, voiceless, and without recourse, perhaps even if the rich, heedless, and arrogant are us. That's it.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.